예, 안녕하세요. 저는 지금 그레이엄 함원의 건축과 객체 출간 기념 화상강연 사회를 맡은 서현식이라고 합니다. 우선 행사 소개를 해드리면, 그래서 오늘 행사는 이제 건축과 객체의 한국어판 출간 기념하는 저자 그레이엄 함원의 전지구 인터넷 화상강연과 대담입니다. 그래서 강연의 제목은 건축과 객체에 대하여입니다. 그래서 강연에 앞서 저를 잠깐 소개해드리면, 저는 이제 다중지성의 정원에서 객체지향 존재론과 건축에 관련해서 지금 세미나를 진행하고 있고요. 건축리를 하고 있고, 2019년도에 이제 함원의 네트워크 군주가 번역돼서 나오면서 국내 최초로, 그 전에는 이제 건축 공부하면서 이제 객체지향 존재론을 이렇게 알게 됐는데, 19년도를 계기로 해서 계속해서 지금까지 함원님의 이제 책들이 많이 번역이 돼서 나와가지고 즐거운 마음으로 그때부터 계속 공부를 하고 있습니다. 예, 제 소개는 끝났고요. 그 진행에 대한 공지를 좀 해드릴 텐데, 이제 오늘 강연은 총 세 개로 나눠서 이제 진행이 되는데요. 1부는 이제 그레이어 하머님의 이제 영어 강연이 있고, 두 번째로 이제 제가 그 하머님과 이제 미리 주어진 질문으로 이제 질문과 대답하는 시간이 있고요. 10분 정도 쉰 다음에 이제 다른 참여하신 분들과의 이제 하먼 선생님과의 대담이 있습니다. 그래서 일단 일부 강연 시간에 하모님은 이제 영어로 강연을 해주실 거고, 화면에는 이제 한글 번역본이 이제 공유됩니다. 그래서 강연문의 원문과 번역본은 신청서에 기입하신 메일로 보내드렸는데, 혹시 못 받으신 분들은 채팅창에 메일 주소를 남겨주시면 보내드리겠습니다. 그리고 이제 원활한 그 진행을 위해서 이 발표자 하먼 선생님을 제외하고 다른 분들은 다 이제 음소거 상태가 될 겁니다. 양해 부탁드립니다. 강연에 앞서서 이제 그레이엄 하먼 선생님을 좀 소개해드리면 1968년생이시고요. 미합 중국 아이오와 출신의 철학자고, 현재 로스앤젤레스 소재 남가주 대학교 사이아크라고 하죠. 그 학교에 이제 특임 교수로 재직 중이시고, 99년에 시카고의 드폴 대학에서 철학 박사 학위를 취득한 뒤에 2000년부터 최근까지 카이로 소재 아메리칸 대학교에서 철학을 가르치셨고, 현대 지금 이제 말씀드린 대로 이제 사이아크에 재직하고 계시고, 현대 철학의 이제 사변적 실제론 운동을 선도한 이제 핵심 인물로 널리 알려져 있고요. 특히 이제 하이데거와 라뚜르를 기반으로 해서 객체의 형이상학에 관해 연구함으로써 이제 발전시킨 객체지향 존재론 덕분에 이제 아트리뷰에 의해서 세계 예술계에 가장 영향력 있는 인물 100인 중 한 사람으로 또 선정되기도 하셨습니다. 또 존재론 분야 파울로 보치 상의 2022년 수상자로 또 선정되셨습니다. 그래서 간단한 저서를 말씀드리면 네트워크 군주, 쿼드로플 오브제, 브리노 라뚜로, 비유물론, 건축과 객체, 예술과 객체 책들이 이제 쓰셨고요. 그리고 이제 간단하게 요 건축과 객체 책에 대해서 소개를 해드리면, 이제 최근에 객체지향 존재론은 건축 이론가들과 실무자들 사이에서 이제 점점 인기를 끌게 되었는데, 어, 그 잠시만요. 과학기술의 역사 전체에 걸쳐서 객체는 다양한 방식으로 이해됐지만, 지식을 생산하는 데 객체가 능동적인 역할을 수행하는 것으로 이해된 적은 거의 없었습니다. 근데 객체지향 존재론의 창시자 그레이엄 하머니 저술한 건축에 관한 첫 번째 책이 요 건축과 객체고요. 이것은 이제 건축과 철학 사이의 대화를 심화함으로써 동시대 건축의 언어와 실천에 미치는 트리플 O의 역량에 대한 새로운 로드맵을 제공하는 동시에 형태와 기능 사이의 관계에 관한 새로운 구상을 제시하고 있습니다. 그래서 그레이엄 하머는 건축 분야에 가장 깊은 자국을 남긴 관념들을 구상한 세 명의 철학자, 즉 하이데거, 데리다, 들뢰즈에 대한 비판으로 시작하면서 건축에 대한 그들 사유의 한계를 부각시킵니다. 그리하여 하머는 건축의 트리플 O를 사용함으로써 형태와 기능에 관한 전통적인 관념들을 제고할 수 있다고 주장합니다. 그래서 하머는 임마누엘 칸트가 건축을 불순한 것으로 일축한 견해에 대한 설득력 있는 반론과 관계화된 판본의 형태와 기능, 즉 제로 형태와 제로 기능을 이 책에서 제시하고 계십니다. 그래서 피터 아이젠만의 작품에 비판적으로 접근한 이제 램코라스, 프랭크 게리, 그리고 자아드의 건축물을 새롭게 평가함으로써 요 건축과 객체는 건축에 대한 대담한 시각을 제시합니다. 그래서 기능의 제로화라는 어려운 과업을 완수함으로써 건축은 미학적으로 고갈된 전형적인 양식들을 다시 활성화하는 최전선에 자리하게 될 것이라고 하머는 이 책에서 결론 짓고 있습니다. 이렇게 책 소개까지 끝냈고요. 이제 강의 시작하실 텐데 이제 1부 강연을 시작하겠습니다. 그리고 이제 그레이엄 하먼 선생님을 박수로 모셔보겠습니다.
Does this mean I'm supposed to begin or?
Yes, one second.
Okay.
Yes, please begin.
All right. My first lecture at an architectural school was at the Architecture Association in London in April 2007. It felt at the time like it might be an isolated event, and for several years thereafter, no further speaking invitations came from architects. Things began to change in the fall of 2011. During September of that year, I was invited to give multiple lectures at various locations in New York. Although none of them were about architecture, my old college classmate David Rue attended many of the lectures. He was not only an architect, but soon began to spread the word about object-oriented philosophy among architects. That eventually led to my being hired in 2016 at the Southern California Institute of Architecture, usually known as SCI-Arc, in Los Angeles, where I still work today. As many of you may know, David Rue was born in Korea, though he grew up in New York and tells me that his Korean language skills are at about the level of age 5. Other than his immediate family, all of his relatives live in the North, and he has never heard from any of them. In any case, I arrived at SCI-Arc without a special expertise in the field of architectural history and theory, but simply as a philosopher whose ideas had proven to be of interest to a number of architects. The architectural field had already passed through periods of influence dominated in order by Heidegger, Derrida, and Deleuze. When I arrived, the Deleuzian flower was beginning to fade. Of those who wanted architecture to maintain serious dialogue with philosophy, many saw object-oriented philosophy as the best hope, and this put a lot of pressure on me. Another group, at least as large, thought the time had come for architecture to break free of philosophical influence altogether, and this put the pressure on as well. So for half a decade, I read and studied. Most importantly, I listened to what architects were saying and not saying. My developing thoughts on architecture were guided by my more established thoughts on art, which were consolidated in the 2020 book Art and Objects, translated and published by Galmuri last year. And incidentally, in all the countries of the world where I have worked, I have never seen any publisher as fast and efficient as Galmuri. I am still amazed by this company and am happy to be speaking in Seoul again today. The basic standpoint of Art and Objects was that I wanted to defend aesthetic formalism, but not in the previous sense of the term. The grandfather of formalism in the arts was surely Immanuel Kant, even though, as far as I know, he only used the word formalism in connection with ethics. This word is used in different contexts to mean different things, but in Kant, the term refers to the autonomy or self-containment of anything apart from influence by its context. Famously, in Kant's ethics, an action is not ethical if it is motivated by external purposes, such as wanting to go to heaven and avoid going to hell, or wanting to gain a good reputation, or wanting to avoid a feeling of guilt for not doing the right thing. An ethical action must be done for its own sake. A number of valid criticisms have been made of this position in ethics, but there is a certain undeniable core of truth to it. To perform an action for some reason external to the action itself is not really ethics, but something else. In the book Dante's Broken Hammer, I had already formed an alliance with the colorful German philosopher Max Scheler, born midway between Husserl and Heidegger. His great book on ethics defended Kant for not letting ethics be motivated by external purposes, while criticizing him for making ethics too empty and too universal. Scheler regrounded ethics in love, meaning a strong passion for some things as opposed to others. Certain ethical duties are binding on me as an individual, or me as an American, or me as a husband, or me as a middle-aged professor, that do not weigh on all those who do not fit these descriptions. Returning to art, the formalism of Kant's critique of judgment can be seen in his view that an artwork cannot be paraphrased in terms of a meaning, that it is not reducible to my personal like or dislike for it, that it must be judged by taste rather than the concepts of the intellect. Yet the problem with Kant's conception of autonomy in the aesthetic sphere was his assumption that autonomy must mean that the aesthetic beholder must stand at a distance from the work. Thus, we have Kant's emphasis on calm disinterest as the right way to approach art. And in his present-day admirer, the art critic and historian Michael Fried, this takes the form of a distaste for theatricality. The artwork is not supposed to make any direct appeal to the beholder. In fact, it is better if the figures in a painting are so absorbed in what they are doing that they have no energy left over to pay attention to us who look at them. Fried admits that this is a supreme fiction, since there would obviously be no painting if there were no one to view it. But he still aims at an ideal case of calm and distant observation of art, just as Kant would have liked. This is crystal clear in Fried's famous early rejection of minimalism, and almost crystal clear in his wonderful book on anti-theatrical painting in the age of the French philosopher and art critic Diderot, who shared Fried's distaste for theater. I say almost crystal clear because from the beginning, Fried realizes the problem with his position. For one thing, in a painter such as Jacques-Louis David, the most prominent artist of the French Revolutionary period, it is often impossible to tell whether a given painting is anti-theatrical or, in fact, extremely theatrical. Fried's position becomes even more problematic in the next two books of his trilogy on French painting. The next book was Courbet's Realism, where Fried shows beyond a doubt that Gustave Courbet deliberately broke down the distinction between himself and his paintings, effectively painting himself into his own canvases in almost the most theatrical way possible. Then came the book Manet's Modernism, in which Fried described Manet's breakthrough modernist paintings in terms of facingness. The central figure of a Manet painting often looks at us directly in a kind of challenge, and even the application of the paint seems to press directly against the viewer's eyes. To summarize, in Art and Objects, I summarized Fried's art historical career as an involuntary path of coming to terms with the inevitable theatricality of art. But this does not spell the end of formalism. Art is still autonomous, but instead of the artwork remaining autonomous from the human beholder, as for Kant and his descendants, art becomes a chemical compound made up of both the work and beholder. No one denies that water exists autonomously just because it is made of both hydrogen and oxygen. Likewise, no one should doubt that art is at least relatively autonomous from its surroundings, simply because it is made of both work and human spectator. The new formalism that results leaves much more room for personal contributions by the beholder, and also leaves room for a certain amount of relevance for the socio-political context of works in a way that the old formalism made impossible. It simply entails that any artwork interacts selectively with its context, admitting and denying entry by various factors in the environment. Picasso's Guernica obviously makes a harsh commentary on fascism as well as on the horrors of war, while also excluding everything else going on in the political world during the year of its composition. We now turn to architecture, the topic of my latest book to be translated into Korean. Here I was inspired once again by Kant, who after all is the major philosopher of aesthetics, and not just aesthetics, in the past 2.5 centuries. Kant first notes that certain kinds of beauty are not pure, since they are contaminated by ulterior motives. He mentions the beauty of a horse, which probably makes us think of the speed and monetary value of the horse. He then mentions the beauty of a human body, which again is hard to experience purely, since it is likely to be contaminated in some way by lust. From here, he turns to architecture, which is ruled out as pure beauty due to its utility. Another way of putting it is that for Kant, architecture fails the formalist test, for it is inevitably tangled up in its surroundings. But in Art and Objects, I had already demonstrated that such entanglement is not a problem. At the very least, all art requires an entanglement of an interested beholder with a work. We get formalism not by cutting the link between the two, as Kant and the early Fried wished, but by seeing this particular entanglement as cut off from the environment of further possible entanglements. But this made architecture look more promising than ever, since the very fact of its usefulness forces it to confront the limits of Kantian formalism in a way that visual art is not forced to do. However much or little a given architect tries to emphasize the function or program of a given building, architecture is not pure engineering. It is also a design discipline, which means an aesthetic discipline. When we speak about aesthetics, we usually think that the key opposition is between the beautiful and the ugly. But here I strongly disagree. The ugly is actually just an unlucky cousin of the beautiful. To see something ugly is also to have an aesthetic experience, even if an unpleasant one rather than a pleasant one. The true opposite of the beautiful, I say, is the literal. Consider the following sentence from Reuters Financial News for July 31st, 2023. All three major stock indexes ended Monday little changed, but with gains for the month, ahead of a busy week of earnings reports from companies including Amazon and Apple, plus U.S. economic data, including the jobs report. Notice that this sentence is neither beautiful nor ugly, but simply literal. For reasons that can't be explained in detail here, I have often defined literalism as the notion that an object is nothing more than the sum total of its qualities. This makes David Hume the supreme literalist in the history of Western philosophy, since he held that an object is nothing more than a bundle of qualities. There is no unified apple hiding behind the red, hard, solid, slippery coldness we feel and see. I have also made the case that phenomenology in philosophy is, above all else, a critique of Hume's literalism. For Edmund Husserl and his heirs, the object comes before its qualities. A thing can change all of its qualities within certain limits and still remain the same object. In this spirit, I have argued that aesthetics essentially refers to any experience that drives a wedge between an object and its qualities. I have often shown how this happens in the case of metaphor, though it also happens in cases such as love, courage, embarrassment, jokes, and others I have dealt with elsewhere. Now, architecture since the 19th century has often been described in terms of the opposition between form and function, even though some have questioned this distinction or tried to reduce one of these terms completely to the other. But I tend to agree with Patrick Schumacher that both are indispensable to architecture. All form and no function would mean we are dealing with sculpture rather than architecture. And all function without form would mean we are in the realm of engineering, trying to solve a given building problem with a strict economy of technological means. The problem, as I see it, is that both form and function have been taken too literally, which means that they have not really been explored in a purely aesthetic sense. To deliteralize something means to formalize it, to make it autonomous, to split it off from its own qualities, but also from its surroundings, if only partially, since architectural objects, like all others, do exist in a world of relations rather than in private vacuums. How are form and function usually treated? We speak of the form of a building. When we speak of the form of a building, we are usually speaking of its visual look. Yet it should be clear that this cannot be what the form of a building truly is. For one thing, a building is a three-dimensional object that can be seen from many angles, distances, and viewpoints. We might pick our favorite viewpoint and distance and take a postcard photograph of it. But we cannot exhaust the form of a building with a single photograph from anywhere. And more than this, the building also has an interior, and to enter that interior means to have a series of experiences held together by memory. Surprisingly, this was seen most clearly by the young Peter Eisenman, who later took such a different path in his building and his thinking. As for the function of a building, we normally think of this as its use or purpose, meaning its current use or purpose. But there are problems here as well. In fact, let's start with the problems of literalist function. One of the classic early books of what might be called postmodern architecture was Architecture of the City by the Italian Aldo Rossi. One of the most famous sections of this book is entitled Critique of Naive Functionalism. Writing from the densely historical built environment of his home country, Italy, Rossi points out that many buildings now have a different function from their original one, and many, such as monuments, never had a definite function to begin with. Consider the school where I work, SCI-Arc in Los Angeles. The building was originally designed to be a freight depot for a railroad. Now it is an architecture school. In between, it was an abandoned building where homeless people lived. And I once met an Uber driver who said he used to pay the homeless to leave for one night so that he could organize large rave parties inside. In any case, although the interior of the building was intensively renovated before SCI-Arc took over in the year 2000, the basic structure of the building is the same as in its railroad days. But whether we use it as a rail station or an architecture school, a deeper function remains present. We might call it extended horizontal movement along a narrow corridor. This has certain practical consequences for those of us who work there. Since a single hallway extends through the entire building, it is impossible to avoid seeing anyone you might not want to see, unless you leave the building and move from one end to the other along city sidewalks. It also means that quite often official meetings do not need to be scheduled. The director of SciArc can simply walk down the hallway and he is likely to meet everyone he needs to see. There is another example of deep function that is covered in my book, and it involves an interesting article by Geoffrey Kipnis about Rem Koolhaas's failed competition entry for the Tate Modern Museum in London. Kipnis goes so far as to claim that, as brilliant a design as it is, it would have ruined architecture if it had won the competition. The supposed reason is that Koolhaas simply proposed an infrastructural project rather than an architectural one, aiming to circulate the most guests possible through the museum in the least amount of time possible. Kipnis complains gently that there was no reason this design had to be for an art museum in particular. But if we recall Rossi's words about the shifting functions of a building over time, this actually starts to sound like a positive rather than a negative, as if what Koolhaas had really delivered was an abstract function. Or in Kipnis's more colorful description, Koolhaas seems to have taken the design brief and hacked away its flesh and muscle and even skeleton, leaving only a nervous system of the building intact. But it seems to me that this is on the right track as a strategy for deliteralizing the function of a building and therefore aestheticizing it. As for deliteralizing the form of a building, I have already mentioned the need for movement, for varied experiences appearing in sequence, and for anchors to be established from memory to hold all of it together. This suggests a number of departures from the usual aesthetic of modernism. The need for variety suggests asymmetry, an embargo on being able to see the whole from a single privileged vantage point, agglomeration of different forms onto each other of a building, in a quasi-Gothic manner, and perhaps even a touch of the old picturesque, which more or less went out of fashion with the end of Romanticism. These are just a few ideas for how to deal with a more pressing central concern, how to remove architecture from its excessively literal interpretation of both form and function, the two recent pillars of the discipline. Thank you very much.
예, 감사합니다. 네, 이제 강연 잘 들었는데요. 일단 그 다음 순서로 이제 아까 처음에 공지해드린 대로 지정질의자 Q&A 시간인데요. 제가 그러면 지정질의자로서 이 질의응답 시간을 시작하겠습니다. 그래서 그레이엄 하머님께 제가 작성한 4개의 질문을 미리 영어로 전달해 드렸고요. 제가 한글로 질문을 하고 그레이엄 하머님께서 영어로 답변해 주시겠습니다. 그래서 그레이엄 하머님의 답변은 그 통역자님께서 통역을 해 주실 예정입니다. 먼저 첫 번째, 제가 이제 거의 건축 관련된 질문 위주로 해서 조금 아쉽기도 한데, 먼저 첫 번째 질의 드리겠습니다. 그래서 오늘 내용에 나온 것처럼 이 샤먼의 트위터 농담이 나오는데요, 책에서. 그래서 트리플 O를 오직 은폐성으로만 잘못 해석한 점을 하모님 선생님이 지적하면서 객체와 그 성질들 사이의 긴장의 사례를 들어주신 점이 저는 개인적으로 흥미로웠습니다. 특히 그 사례로서 OMA, 그 램크로스가 있는 사무실이죠. OMA의 이제 빌라 달라바 같은 경우는 이 감각적 객체와 실제적 성질의 사이의 긴장, 그래서 이제 그거 형상적 긴장이라고 하셨는데, 그런 사례들과 이제 마크 포스터 게이지 같은 이제 그 트리플 O의 영향을 받은 건축가죠. 이분이 이제 데저트 리조트 사례를 드시면서 감각적 객체와 감각적 성질 둘 사이의 이 수평적 긴장, 이런 이제 건축적 사례가 나와서 저는 좋았습니다. 그런데 같은 작품이라도 이 해석하는 사람에 따라서 이제 다른 객체와 성질의 긴장으로도 볼 수 있는 건 아닌지, 그런 다양한 해석이 열려 있는 게 아닌지 궁금합니다. 이렇게 이제 질문을 드렸습니다.
Yes, Professor Harman, we're going on to the 4 questions prepared by Mr. Sayan-sik, and he's just read in Korean the first one that I put up in the chat section.
Very good. So should I answer it now or?
Yes, please.
All right. The question of why, this is the first question. Yes, the same work could be seen as tension between different objects and qualities for different reasons in each case. When we're talking about real objects, since no direct observation of the real object is possible, then various different approximations of the real are always possible. Triple O is a realism, but not in the sense of a realism that thinks it can see reality directly. it sees reality always in a mediated way, and therefore real objects can never be grasped directly, and so different interpretations are always possible. And as for the sensual objects, this always has to do with an individual's interaction with the work, the artwork or the architectural work, and so therefore even more strongly, different interpretations are possible. Of course, some interpretations will turn out to be better than others, and a consensus will form as to what those are, but there's never no way to ever have a perfect interpretation of a building. That's true.
네, 말씀하신 대로 해석하는 사람에 따라서 같은 작품이라 하더라도 다른 객체와 성질의 긴장으로 보일 수 있습니다. 실제 객체에 대해 말씀을 드리자면은 실제라는 것은 다양한 각도의 관점이 가능한 것입니다. 객체지향 존재론에서는 객체지향 존재론은 실제론이지만 실제를 직접 볼 수 있거나 실제를 파악할 수 있다라고 생각하는 실제론이 아니라 그렇게 할 수 없다는 실제론이기 때문에 당연히 다양한 해석들이 가능할 것이고요. 그리고 어떤 해석들이 더 나은지, 가장 최선의 것인지, 완벽한 해석이 있을 수 있다, 이런 것은 객체지향 존재론에서는 가능하지 않다고 생각합니다.
예, 답변 감사드립니다. 그래서 특히 이제 이런 건축의 어떤 실례를 들면서 이 각 내겹 객체의 어떤 긴장, 사례가 나와서 좋아서 질문을 드렸는데, 예, 첫 번째 질문 드렸던 거고요. 그리고 이제 두 번째 질의로 가겠습니다. 두 번째는 이제 마크 포스터 게이지, 그 책에서도 이제 잠깐 소개가 되죠. 데저트 리조트 사례로 이미지도 나오고, 또 톰 미스콤브 같은 이제 건축가들은 트리플 O를 건축적 사고와 설계 방법론의 중심으로 놓고 작업을 하는 대표적인 건축가들인데, 이 책에서 이제 사례로 잘 다뤄지지 않고 있어서 저는 이제 그 이유가 좀 궁금했는데요. 예, 그게 이제 두 번째 질문이었습니다.
Okay, you went on to the second question.
In the case of Kohlhaas, I was emphasizing the zeroing of function, and another case of that was the use I made of Aldo Rossi and what he says about historical buildings in Italy, especially, that they change their functions over time, and therefore the deep function of the building cannot be identified with any specific purpose at any historical moment. And there are lots of examples in pre-modern architecture when you look at monuments. So, for example,
he's just read question number 2. I'm sorry if there was a confusion.
Oh, I see 4 on the screen.
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
then I'll go back and answer 2.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. Yeah, there's a very interesting story about why Mark Foster Gage and Tom Wiscombe don't play much of a role in this book, and that is, originally they were supposed to. In my original proposal for the book to University of Minnesota Press, I was talking quite a bit about contemporary architects working in the OOO medium, and a very good outside reviewer who wrote a wonderful review with many suggestions said I had already written a lot about these architects my own age, and it was maybe time for me to take a stand on some of the more established modern figures. This is why, in particular, Peter Eisenman and a little bit Bernard Tschumi and also Rem Koolhaas and a little bit Zaha Hadid also played some role in the book because I was asked to do so by the press reviewer.
네, 그 마크 포스터 게이지와 위스콤 같은 경우에는 제가 처음에 출판사에 제출했던 출간 제안서에서는 많이 다루어져 있던 인물들이었는데요. 근데 그 원고를 읽은 한 외부 리뷰어께서 그 두 사람이나 그 그레이엄 하먼 선생님과 동년배의 건축가들에 대해서는 이미 많은 글들을 쓰셨으니까 이번 책에서는 다른 기성의 근대 건축가들에 대해서 좀 입장을 밝혀주시고 하는 게 어떻겠냐고 하는 그 훌륭한 리뷰어분들의 의견을 받아들여서 아이젠맨이나 콜하스나 하디드 같은 인물들을 이번 책에서는 많이 다루게 되었습니다.
예, 감사합니다. 세 번째 질문인데요. 개인적으로는 이제 이 세포라는 게 굉장히 인상적이었는데, 그거 관련된 질문인데, 예술의 세포적 구조로 봤을 때 시각 예술뿐만 아니라 이제 다른 매체의 예술 분야와 비교해도 건축은 다양한 관계와 비관계의 결투로 이 다양한 사변적 기회가 있다고 이제 책에 나와 있었고, 그렇게 이제 저도 생각이 되는데, 이제 그런 측면에서 이제 라뚜르나 야네바 같은 ANT와 같은 관계주의 모형보다 오히려 객체지향 존재론 트리플 O의 세포적 모형이 이 건축이라는 분과 학문에 더욱 적합한 모형으로 보여지는데, 이에 대한 좀 그 하모님의 생각을 예, 궁금해서 질문해봤습니다. 예.
Okay, now he's just read question 3. Your answer, please.
Yes. First, let me say about actor network theory that I owe an incredible debt to Bruno Latour, who unfortunately died last October. But there is a big difference between OOO and actor network theory. Bruno Latour talks about how any object is a black box where you can't see what's inside it, but you can always open the black box and find out how a fact was made or how an object was made. And he and Albina Yaneva co-authored an interesting article on architecture where they want to say that an architectural object is not just an object, that you can and should open it up and look at all the various political and architectural factors that went into making it. And I think that leads to interesting results, but it's not an architectural result. It leads to something like an ethnography of architecture. Because when a building is designed, it's designed for end users who don't need to know everything about the backstory of the building unless they want to. A black box doesn't just hide. It also renders some of the history of the building unnecessary for the users to know. I don't have to know what made all the factors that went into a building if I'm using it. And so the architectural experience does not have to be a historical experience. Perhaps having some historical knowledge about the field or about the background of a certain building can enhance your appreciation, but you really don't need to know all the details. And so an architectural work, like any object for OOO, is something at least partly self-contained that forgets much of the history that went into it. And that's fine to some extent. Not every user of a building or every beholder of an artwork needs to know the entire history behind it.
Okay, let me check 2 things. So the black box hides, but you can open it and you can see how it was made, right? That's what
Right.
Latour says.
Yes.
And who is the co-author of the paper?
Albina Yaneva from Bulgaria.
Thank you. 네. 일단은 ANT 그 행위자 연결망 이론에 대해 제가 많은 빚을 졌고 지난 9월 작고하신 라투르 선생님께 제가 많은 빚을 졌다라는 걸 먼저 말씀드리고 있고요. 그리고 행위자 연결망 이론과 OOO는 여러 가지 큰 차이들이 있습니다. 그리고 라투르의 경우에는 객체를 블랙박스라고 말하는데요. 그러니까 숨어 있지만 그것을 열어서 그것이 어떻게 만들어졌는지 이런 것들을 모두 알 수 있다라고 하는 그 블랙박스라는 개념을 갖고 있습니다. 그리고 라투르가 알베나 야네바라고 하는 불가리아 분과 건축에 대해서 공동 논문을 쓰신 것이 있는데요. 그래서 건축 객체는 객체가 아니다. 그냥 열어서는 모든 것을 알 수 없다. 이런 취지 주장을 하시는데 그 주장이 흥미로운 결과를 갖고 오는 건 맞지만 그 결과가 건축적이라고 생각하지 않습니다. 어떤 건축에 대한 민속지학 같은 것으로 이어진다고 생각합니다. 왜냐하면 설계될 때 그 사용자가 그것의 기능이나 그것의 역사를 모두 알 수 있도록 설계되지 않고 그럴 필요가 없기 때문인데요. 건축적 객체의 경우에는요. 그래서 블랙박스는 은폐하지만 사용자가 알 수 없는 것들을 숨기기도 한다. 그러니까 열어서 모든 걸 다 알 수 없다. 이렇게 말씀을 하셨고요. 그래서 건축적 경험이라는 것은 역사적 경험일 필요가 없고 세부 사항을 사용자가 다 알 필요가 없다. 어떻게 보면 좀 자족적이라고 할 수 있고 역사를 막 상실해버리는 면이 있는데 그것은 필연적이다. 모든 사용자 감상자가 모든 그 건축 객체의 역사를 알 필요가 없다라고 생각합니다. Did they say about architecture that you can open it, the black box, but you can't know everything? Is that their thesis?
No, they think you can. They think you can open it and go into all the details. I'm saying you can't really. You don't need to.
네, 야네바 라투르의 논문의 그 주장은 블랙박스를 열어서 모든 걸 알 수 있다라는 게 야네바 라투르님의 주장이고요. 하머님의 생각은 알 수 없다. 왜냐하면 말씀드렸듯이 그 설계될 때 그 감상자와 사용자가 그 역사를 다 아는 것을 목표로 하면서 설계가 되지 않기 때문이다. 이렇게 정정하겠습니다.
예, 답변 감사드립니다. 평상시에 이제 ANT와 트리플 O의 어떤 차이점에 대해서도 흥미를 갖고 있었는데 건축 안에서도 똑같이 그 철학적인 개념뿐만 아니라 건축 안에서도 그러한 차이가 비슷하게 있다라는 게 확인돼서 좋았고요. 이제 마지막 질문인데요. 특히 이제 이번 건축과 객체 책 마지막 장에서 이 건축에서 형태와 기능의 제로화, 제로 펑션, 뭐 제로 폼, 요 사례로 램코라스의 작품들을 주로 예로 드시고 계신데 혹시 이러한 제로화의 사례로 다른 사례가 있는지도 궁금하고 이제 현대 건축의 사례 말고도 이런 비직서주의 건축의 사례가 또 있는지 예, 궁금합니다. 이렇게 질문 드렸습니다.
This was question 4.
Yes.
All right. Yes, when speaking about Kohlhaas, I was emphasizing the zeroing of function. And other examples in my book come from Aldo Rossi's discussion of monuments and how they all buildings tend to pass through many different functions, and so they're not identified with any of them. And if you want to look to further examples in older architecture, I think most older architecture becomes a kind of non-literal function. For instance, when I spent all those years in Egypt for 16 years, and I never became bored with the pyramids. There is something so overwhelming about the Great Pyramids at Giza. And yes, they had a function. The function was to prepare the pharaoh for his journey to the afterlife. But no one believes in the ancient Egyptian religion anymore. And so it no longer has that function. Its function is something non-functional. It's something cosmic. It's something that monumental, something you can see from the city center of Cairo, even though it's pretty far out on the outskirts. From a tall building in the city center of Cairo, you can see the pyramids. And so that's one example for me of something that really isn't functional anymore, except as something to generate tourist money for the Egyptian government. It's passed well beyond anything functional. And I think the longer something exists, the more it becomes that, the more it becomes deliteralized. The longer something survives, the less literal it is. I think that's a general rule. Things that are old take on a certain kind of aesthetic effect. Old clothes. When I try to read the English of Shakespeare or of Chaucer, it's different enough from what I speak today that I have to work a little bit to understand it. It gives a kind of aesthetic effect that you don't get from everyday American English from the present. So, and historical costumes fascinate us for much the same reason. They're no longer purely functional as things to clothe our body with. They're also aesthetic in some way. So I think the work of time does a lot of deliteralization for us.
콜하스 같은 경우는 기능의 제로화를 강조하기 위해서 참조했던 인물이고요. 또 제가 이탈리아의 그 로시라는 분의 사례를 들어서 기념물들, 그러니까 낡은 건물들이 역사 속에서 기능이 계속 변한다는 점, 그러니까 건축물을 하나의 기능에 묶어둘 수 없고 그것을 환원할 수 없다라는 점을 말씀드리기 위해서 로시 얘기를 책에서 했습니다. 그리고 많은 사례들이 있을 텐데요. 대체로 이제 시간이 오래된 건축물들은 비직서적인 기능으로 점점점 된다라고 생각합니다. 저 같은 경우는 이집트에서 16년을 살았는데요. 피라미드라는 건축물에 대해서 질린 적이 한 번도 없습니다. 뭔가 그 압도하는 그것이, 그 피라미드는 원래 애초에 지어질 때는 파라오의 사후세계로 가는 길과 관련된 어떤 기능이 있었지만 지금은 그런 종교를 믿는 사람이 없습니다. 기능이 달라졌다고도 볼 수 있을 것이고 기능이 어떤 우주적이고 기념비적이고 비관계적인 것이 되었습니다. 카이로 도심에서 피라미드를 볼 수가 있는데요. 지금 같은 경우는 이집트 정부를 위한 관광 그 자본, 관광 수익을 준다라는 점 정도의 기능이 있을 뿐이고 오래 존재할수록 피라미드처럼 덜 직서적인 것으로 되고 또 오래된 것이 미학적인 효과를 갖게 된다. 그래서 제가 셰익스피어나 초서 같은 고전 작품들을 읽으면 일상 미국 영화에서는 느끼지 못하는 어떤 미학적 효과들을 느끼게 되고요. 또 역사적인 코스튬들, 과거에 입었던 의복 양식들 같은 걸 보면은 그 의복으로서의 기능은 지금은 상실되지 않았습니까? 그러니까 옷의 기능이 아니라 어떤 미학적인 효과를 우리가 느끼게 됩니다. 그래서 시간이 하는 일이 많이 있다고 생각이 됩니다.
예, 답변 감사드립니다. 주로 저는 건축 위주로 질문을 드렸었는데, 예, 그 답변을 다 잘 해주신 것 같습니다. 그래서 지금 한 10분, 2부까지 마쳤는데요. 10분 정도 이제 쉬고 1시 50분에 질의응답 시간 가지면 좋을 것 같습니다. 예, 그럼 1시 50분에 뵙는 걸로 하겠습니다.
Okay, we'll now take a 10-minute break and then come back at 8:50, no, 9:50.
9:50, sure. Thank you.